We have these cycles within the drama of American democracy where people will use these taglines to completely label something as un-American. And so therefore, you don't even bother engaging with the ideas.
Lerone A. Martin is the author of the book The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism. He's also the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies at Stanford University. You might remember Lerone from an episode we did back in 2020 where we discussed his other book, Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph and the Making of Modern African American Religion. For this episode, Lerone explains how the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, colluded with Christian leaders and tastemakers to shape the soul of America throughout the 20th century, and we discuss the echoes of that architecture that still remain today. We'll see how Hoover's version of institutionalized American Christianity reflected the conservative politics he wanted to continue to manifest in the national culture, the supremacy of whiteness, masculinity, and free market capitalism. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am thrilled to welcome back a guest that we had on in 2020. We were just talking about how surreal it is that it's been 5 years. Here is Lerone Martin, and he is here to talk about the connections, the historical connections between the FBI and white Christian nationalism. So, you know, you've got a lot coming up here in this episode. So welcome back, Lerone.
It's great to be back, and thank you for having me. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. Okay, so let's just get into it. I've been reading your book and I've been kind of watching some interviews that you've done about your book. And something that I heard was that before you started writing the book that came to fruition that we're talking about today, you were working on a book about Christian radio. And then what happened was that you kind of discovered a couple things that really changed your direction. So would you just talk about the beginnings of the project and how that transformed?
Sure. I finished a book on the role of the phonograph in American religion, about how preachers recorded and sold their sermons with Columbia Records and Paramount Records, and recorded them and sold their sermons, and how that shaped American religious life in the early 20th century. So I thought the next step would be, as radio was ascending and then the phonograph was declining in popularity. And then two things happened. The first thing that happened was I had lunch with a colleague at Washington University in St. Louis, where I used to teach. We had coffee, and he had just finished a wonderful book called FBI's, and it was about how the FBI engaged and read and surveilled African-American writers, people like James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and others. And so he said, as you work on this book on radio, you should check and see if they have FBI files. I'm sure if the FBI was concerned about African-American writers, they probably would be concerned about preachers as well on the radio.
Right.
So I took his advice. That was in April of 2014. And then that summer, Michael Brown was killed in St. Louis, Missouri, and living in St. Louis at the time, there in the center of it all. I talked to a number of ministers who had told me that the FBI had reached out to them for their assistance. They basically had said to a number of prominent ministers, we're pretty sure we know the direction this indictment's going to go. We don't think the officer is going to be indicted. So, how can we partner to make sure this city doesn't explode?
Wow.
And so when these ministers told me this, it got me thinking, how long has the FBI been reaching out to clergy for assistance? We often think of the FBI and thinking about surveilling people. But it made me think, what about the other direction? Is there a relationship between the FBI and not surveilling ministers, but attempting to partner with ministers? So instead of focusing on ministers, radio preachers that I thought the FBI wouldn't like, I decided to start making a Freedom of Information Act request for ministers I thought the FBI might like.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Who's preaching a message and who stands for things the FBI at this time under J. Edgar Hoover would be attracted to. And so that led me to start making different kinds of requests for Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashal, who was the first preacher, white or black, to have his own television show beginning in the late 1940s. I started looking at Billy Graham. I started looking at Campus Crusade for Christ, the National Association of Evangelicals, and all these groups. And I started getting information. And I started getting FBI files that was not about surveillance, but was about cooperation. It was about partnering with the FBI. And that's what got me started on writing this book.
Wow, that is quite a beginning. Can you tell us what was it like when you were trying to get those FBI files? Did you run into a lot of roadblocks with that?
So I for the most part, I didn't run into any roadblocks, but the biggest roadblock, and I opened the book up with this story, the biggest roadblock was trying to get the FBI file or files for Billy Graham. The FBI played very loose and fast with the rules of the Freedom of Information Act. And so originally when I filed, I waited till he passed away, which the law states that deceased persons no longer have privacy rights for textual materials.
Okay.
Since he had passed away in 2018, I believe, around that time, I filed for his FBI file. And the FBI basically responded by saying, we don't know if we have anything, but if we do, we'll let you know at some point. And I knew that was against the law because the law states they have to make a determination within 20 business days. But, I was thinking it's the federal government, it's the FBI, there's really nothing I can do. I ended up meeting a wonderful attorney who teaches at Villanova, Tuwan Samahan, and we met through a friend, and we're talking about our research. And I told him what I was working on, and I said, "Yeah, but it's the FBI. What am I going to do?" And he said, "I'm telling you what you're going to do. You're going to sue, just like a good lawyer, right?"
Uh-huh.
I was like, I know nothing about that. He was like, "I'll walk you through it." And so he took my case. And so we filed a lawsuit in federal court saying that the FBI, was not following the rules of the Freedom of Information Act. And so we went back and forth, and the judge ordered a summary judgment that the FBI, if they had anything, they had to turn things over to me on a rolling basis. And so every few months, I would get like 500 pages of documentation. Most of the documentation I received on him was about the FBI investigating death threats, or the FBI sort of knowing his whereabouts and where he's going or what he's doing, lots of newspaper clippings. But that's all I really got from them. But what was helpful in getting that file was I started realizing that there were connections to Billy Graham's world. And so that's when I started making FBI requests for Christianity Today, the National Association of Evangelicals, the National Religious Broadcasters, the world that Billy Graham was involved in. I started requesting those files. And that's what really opened up an avenue for me to write this book.
Okay. So you got those files. And from there, I think that you knew that a person that you needed to focus on, the person you needed to focus on was J. Edgar Hoover, who was kind of one of the big architects of the FBI as we know it.
That's right.
And I was wondering if you could give us a little Hoover primer in terms of, we know who he is, but we don't know about kind of the man himself, what he believed and what his religion was, which would eventually inform his politics and the things that he did within the government. So can you give us just a little idea of who little Edgar was and kind of how he got to where he was in the FBI?
J. Edgar Hoover was a man who believed America was a Christian nation that should be led by and should be for white people. He was born in the late 19th century. He was born in 1895 in Washington, D.C., lived his entire life in Washington, D.C. He was a young man of the church. He taught Sunday school as a youngster. His childhood diary, teenage diary, is filled with entries where he's saying, preparing for Sunday school, preparing my Sunday lesson. He is very, very adamant about teaching Sunday school. He also belonged to the cadets at his high school. And so he would actually, according to his friends, he would show up to teach Sunday school in his cadet uniform.
Wow.
So we had this kind of idea of masculinity, kind of very militaristic soldier, and its relationship to Christianity. He carried that with him to be the head of the FBI. So he became the head of the FBI in 1924. And while he joined the FBI, he immediately got rid of all the folks in the FBI that weren't white men. So there were some women working in the FBI. It was called the Bureau of Investigation at that time. And he got rid of the people of color who were working there. And he recreated this organization according to his idea of masculinity and Christianity. In fact, he even had his agent sign a pledge. It was called the Law Enforcement Pledge. It said in part that I will, as a minister, seek to serve and advise others, and I will, as a soldier, wage vigorous warfare against the enemies of my country. And so he came with this idea of both creating an FBI into this sort of paramilitary organization that would be guided by the ideas of being a soldier and being a minister. And that's how he formed his FBI. And it's a very organized organization. He created departments and units. And what was brilliant about what he did is that he did create, as you stated, the modern FBI in terms of bringing science into investigative techniques. He created the FBI laboratory, testing fibers of materials and footprints and tire tracks, and got the federal government to allow FBI agents to carry weapons. And he's really the architect of the modern FBI. And part of that architecture that scholars have overlooked, and the public has overlooked more generally, is that it's the backbone of that is really his idea of Christianity, right, and his idea that Christian men should run society and everyone else should be subservient to it. And that's how his worldview was shaped, and that's how he shaped his FBI. So
I can't help but think about, again, little Edgar growing up at the turn of the century with like Teddy Roosevelt as an influence, right? As the influence with his ideas of masculinity. I mean, his almost cartoonish ideas of masculinity and, this nativist sort of anti-immigration viewpoint. So I just think that that's a very interesting thing to think about. Like he's, 5 years old or however old he would have been right at that moment. And this is the messaging he's getting. That's right. And he lives in D.C. You're exactly right. And his family were civil servants. And so they're involved with the federal government. So you're exactly right. This is the message he would have received that was in the air at the time. He would have received it at his high school, and he would have received it at his church. He talked about this minister that was a youthful minister who he was really influential. And he talked about how, he was a good, strong Calvinist, Presbyterian. And Hoover says, this was my ideal of manhood. This man was godly, but he was young. He played baseball with Hoover and all his friends when they were kids. And Hoover says, this is some of the early examples of masculinity, because Hoover's father was actually put what we would consider today would be a mental health institution, but at the time was called a sanitarium. And so looking for other sort of masculine figures in his life, he turned in part to his pastor and talked about it for the rest of his life, that's where he really started thinking about masculinity and the type of man he wanted to be. So much so, Hoover says, he tells one person who wrote into the FBI that he'd really come close to going into the ministry. Wow. Oh, well done. He thought about going to seminary, but he says he didn't go because with his father being committed into a mental health institution, he felt that he needed to go to take a path that would allow him to make money sooner rather than later to help take care of his mother as being the only child. And so he goes into law school. He starts taking classes at night and working at the Library of Congress during the day. Okay, so this man who wishes he could have been a minister starts to create this new FBI and starts to essentially collude with preachers and, other religious leaders across the country, especially powerful religious leaders. So how did that start? How did he begin to become almost like this darling of the religious leaders of America? So much so, like you kind of frame your book around the giant stained glass piece in DC of Hoover, which was felt so random to me, but it made sense as I went on. But how did that relationship begin?
It begins by America sees an FBI that is being trained to be soldiers and ministers. So Hoover begins to have FBI agents attend spiritual retreats. So agents go on spiritual retreats. It's done under the Catholic order of the Jesuits. So that the Jesuit spiritual retreats of St. Ignatius, spiritual exercises, of St. Ignatius. And these exercises are all about helping men to examine themselves, to live lives like Christ, but also, though, like Ignatius himself, to think about themselves as soldiers for Christ. Because Ignatius was a former soldier who had turned his sword over to be a Christian. He also has worship services throughout the country, and especially in the D.C. area for the D.C. area FBI agents, where they go and they have a worship service at a Protestant church for his agents. And he always, writes a message to the agents about how they're fighting for God and they're working to rid the country of all evil and demonic forces, including communism and promiscuity and things of this nature. And then he also has communion breakfasts where he'll have agents, Protestant and Catholic, go to these communion breakfasts where they'll have a breakfast subsidized by taxpayers. And they'll have a minister or a prominent person come in and speak to them about how the FBI is the front guard of American Christianity, protecting the homeland against evil foreign forces. So as Hoover does that, people start praising him. This is the guy that is leading the country. And as we fight godless communism and fight all these other godless forces, we have this Christian man protecting us. And so from there, he becomes a darling and a trusted figure amongst American Christians and especially American clergy. So much so that as Hoover becomes a contributing writer for Christianity Today, many ministers will write to the FBI and say, I read Mr. Hoover's essay in Christianity Today, and I normally preach my own sermon, but the article was so good, I simply read it from the pulpit as my sermon.
Wow.
So Hoover starts through his pen as writing for Christianity Today. He starts ghostwriting sermons across American pulpits during this period, right?
He became the minister he wanted to be.
In that sense, great point. In that sense, exactly, he becomes the minister he wants to be. And the FBI, and on the file, the FBI agents are saying, Mr. Hoover, we're receiving all these letters of people saying that, they preached their sermon. Like, this is great. This is having the effect we wanted to have, that we're able now to influence American ministers to make sure they're doing their job. So much so that the FBI files are also filled with people writing letters. They begin asking their pastor or their bishop or their deacon for advice, and they start writing Hoover for advice, right? Like, Mr. Hoover, should I watch Billy Graham on television? Should I watch Oral Roberts? Are these people okay? What about Campus Crusade for Christ? Are they okay? Is it okay if my church does raffles? I mean, they were asking him any and every these theological, moral questions that you would think would be reserved for their church or for their deacon or bishop or pastor, but they start bypassing and asking Mr. Hoover. And I'll end with this. There's one letter I cite in the book. A woman says, she says flat out, there's no one in this country that people trust more than the FBI. Wow. They don't trust Republicans. They don't trust Democrats. They don't trust ministers on TV. So if you just tell me what to do, I'll do it because you're the person that everyone trusts.
Oh, that is it's bizarre to hear. It really is bizarre to hear.
Yeah, most of us can't imagine writing Patel, who's now the head of the FBI, or even before him, right? Christopher Wray. for any type of moral advice, right? But this is the world Hoover lives in, and this is how he's able to be head of the FBI for 48 years, right? You can't run an agency for 48 years without having a critical mass of support.
Right.
And he had that.
And I mean, it seems like he was much more of a celebrity figure than we could ever imagine an FBI, a leader of the FBI to be now. What was that like for people? Like how was this mainly like really religious people that were paying attention to him, or what was his role in public life?
Yeah, certainly. So he is a pop culture celebrity in the sense that there are FBI comic books, there are FBI radio shows, and of course, the
comic books.
Yes, for children, okay. FBI comic books. They come with these little badges that say like, junior FBI agent.
Oh boy!
And then of course there are movies starring the leading stars of the day who are playing FBI agents. And then of course there's the famous FBI TV show, the FBI show. So all of this, points to, and the FBI, by the way, had a hand in all of those things. Like Hoover,
I do not doubt it. Yeah,
Hoover controlled the script. He controlled what was said, the type of crimes, how the agents looked on television, and that only serves to bolster the public idea that FBI agents are these moral people. They're out for good. They're solving crimes for us, and they're protecting us. And that whole entire suite of popular culture activities Hoover does that, and he's a mastermind at shaping public opinion in that regard.
Right. God, that's so interesting.
And today it's not exactly the same, but we still have a number of shows on major networks that focus on the FBI.
Oh yeah.
I mean, CBS has 3 alone, right? There's like FBI, like FBI International or something to this effect. NBC used to have one called The Blind Spot. ABC had one called Quantico. So we still have this kind of fascination with the FBI today. And Hoover really can be credited with creating that image for us.
Oh, that's so wild. This will shock everyone, but there was a time when I was a child that I thought I wanted to be an FBI agent, probably because of the X-Files mainly, which is another example.
Exactly.
A little unorthodox, but
exactly. And just to let you know, you put you in great category, because there's a famous person who applied to be an FBI agent, actually applied, but for whatever reason was not called back, is Richard Nixon.
Wow.
Richard Nixon applied to be an FBI agent, and for whatever reason, we don't know, it's not in the file. For whatever reason, he was never called.
Wow.
But he applied.
Yeah.
But that just goes to show how a young person growing up in America, and Nixon being who he was, very, very earnest, and we could describe him in a number of ways, but earnest is one. And he applies for the FBI, right? And so it just gives you an example of how Americans were inundated with this image.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of back to those Christianity Today letters, and kind of more toward his views in general as they related to Christianity and politics as a fusion. What was he writing about in these letters that turned into sermons? Like, what was the political content?
The political content of most of these, I'll give you a title.
Okay.
One of them was called Christian Renewal or Communist Domination.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the idea is that America, in the midst of the Cold War, America has to have a rededication to traditional Christian values if we are going to win the Cold War and defeat Russia and not be overtaken by godless communism. Mm-hmm. Now, that's useful because what Hoover will do is use the tag of godless communism to explain certain types of social practices that he finds sinful. Right. And he'll say, see, like that's an example of godless communism. So the idea of people protesting in the streets for various rights, including the civil rights movement, that's a sign of godless communism. Mm-hmm. Women cutting their hair, right? Or women trying to work in certain jobs, like that's a sign of godless communism.
Right.
So any social ill, right, he'll point to, young people, wearing long hair or quote unquote hippies, right? Like all of that is a sign of godless communism. we have to rededicate ourselves to traditional Christian values, or the nation will be destroyed. God will visit punishment on us, and that punishment will be dominance by the godless world. And that's typically the message. It's shaped by a gentleman by the name of Fern Stukenbroker, who has a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. He becomes the ghostwriter of most of these. He's a Methodist lay preacher. So he drafts these essays. He gives them to J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover looks them over, makes some slight changes. And then, of course, it's then passed on to Christianity Today. And they typically publish it as it is. And then what's even more fascinating is that the FBI negotiates with Christianity Today to say, we want to also send these out under our cover to various field offices across the country, FBI field offices, and they can also distribute these sermons. So these things are distributed across the country with the FBI Department of Justice stamp on the top. And at the bottom, it'll say reprinted from Christianity Today. So people then get these messages, but what they also get implicitly is that Christianity Today is on the same side as the FBI, and therefore Christianity Today is the true Christian and patriotic magazine, right? So when people will write Hoover, they'll ask him questions about, like, should I listen to this preacher or that preacher? Hoover typically will say, ma'am, just the facts, right? Like, he'll say, we're an investigative agency. I'm not going to tell you left or right. However, if you're interested on my views on religion, here are some essays I wrote for Christianity Today. So that already lets some person know, okay, Christianity Today is the good magazine.
Right.
The Christian Century or other magazines that maybe have more of a leftist or progressive lean in terms of Christianity, those are not considered real Christian magazines.
Right.
So you get the sense that the federal government and the FBI are in lockstep with Christianity Today.
More after this. And now back to the show. We talked about this communism grab bag. He's able to use the word communism, invoke this, demonic force, and then I imagine just slot in whatever he wants to be against in that moment.
There you go.
Something that you mentioned in your book is that, this is all kind of propping up what already exists, which is this idea of white Christian nationalism. And you talk about how during the Cold War, the FBI kind of endorsed this sanitized version of white Christian nationalism. And I'm curious, what that looked like in practice as it was being disseminated out. How were those messages of white Christian nationalism being delivered in a way that was palatable for people?
Yeah. So Hoover will repeatedly say, a good Christian is a good citizen, and a good citizen is a good Christian. So he'll give this idea that citizenship is deeply connected and intertwined with Christianity. And for Hoover, it's not just Christianity, sort of broadly speaking, it's a particular kind of Christianity. It's a Christianity that lifts up sort of male leadership. It lifts up a kind of racial hierarchy as well, a kind of narrow moral ideas about government. The way that the federal government is, Hoover will say that the 10 Commandments are the basis of our democracy. And it gives the idea then, of course, that if God has installed American democracy, anyone who fights against it or protests it is no longer fighting with God, but probably is godless. He will write about America. He says in one essay, America has other religions for sure, but America is a Christian country. So it gives people the message, again, that this is a Christian nation and your citizenship is tied up with believing in Christianity. And again, I myself am a Christian, but I'm not the kind of Christian that J. Edgar Hoover would recognize. Because of the way that my political stance leads me to believe that human beings are all created in the image of God and should be treated accordingly, because of my belief in justice and equality. Hoover will say that I'm not a real Christian. And so
a communist.
I'm probably a communist, exactly, because of my belief in equality. So what that does, of course, is it props up certain ideas within the political realm as expressions of Christianity. So then if you don't support certain political ideas, therefore you are against Christianity. And so Hoover's essays do this in a way that's really slick and clear, and he presents it in a way that is, it's coming from the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah.
And this gives the Americans the idea, okay, this is what it means to be a patriotic American, is to be committed to these traditional, quote unquote, traditional Christian values.
So he's not necessarily saying directly we should have a racial hierarchy. He's saying something more like the traditions in American culture are what we should uphold, which of course implies going, this whole thing that is happening again today, where we need to return to this idealized past, et cetera, et cetera. So he's not being as direct about those things. He's being just more he's like implying things more.
Well, he implies, but also he's very direct. So he'll go before Congress, and then he'll tell the press that the civil rights movement is completely infiltrated by communists.
Right.
So then, therefore, if that's all I have to do is paint this group as communists, then that means anything they stand for is godless and wrong.
There you go.
So then I can just completely dismiss the claims of, hey, these Jim Crow signs, are illegal, or they're demeaning, right? Or they're unchristian. I can dismiss any and everything the civil rights movement is proclaiming because J. Edgar Hoover told me it's riddled with communists.
There you go.
So there are times that he'll do that, and they'll do the same thing for women's rights groups. He'll surveil women's rights groups and basically say they're nothing but a bunch of communists, right? And so it's a way that he uses, as you said so brilliantly, the communist grab bag to broadly paint and dismiss ideals that he doesn't agree with or he finds to be abhorrent, right? And once he does that, you don't really have to engage in the argument, because I've already painted you as being anti-American, or you're being influenced by some un-American force, whether that be communism or feminism or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I think that we can understand this because today the term that's being used is like woke.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all wokeist ideology. And so therefore people who are moved by that don't even bother interrogating the actual political claims or political aims, right? And then maybe 10 years ago, it was sort of, terrorist influence or Islamic influence, right? I mean, we have these cycles within the drama of American democracy where people will use these taglines to completely label something as un-American. And so therefore, you don't even bother engaging with the ideals.
Right. Absolutely. So I think this is a good time to talk about the relationship between the FBI and Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement at large.
Yeah.
So I know that the FBI and Hoover especially considered the Christianity of the civil rights movement of MLK to be the wrong kind, right? So I know they considered him to be this Black Messiah figure that could be really problematic to their political goals. So would you talk a little bit about the relationship that the FBI had to the civil rights movement, especially in regards to religion?
Yeah. The FBI surveils Martin Luther King Jr. And not only surveils him, but engages in a counterintelligence campaign against him from 1963, following his I Have a Dream speech, to his death. And even after his death, they still engage in a counterintelligence campaign against him. They, as one FBI executive will say in his book years later, Cartha DeLoach, he said that the FBI was convinced that King was either a communist in clerical disguise or a useful idiot, to use the Marxist phrase, that King was either being used by the Communist Party himself or that he was a committed communist. And they felt that King was trying to tear America apart because of the way that he was pulling the covers back on all of America's ills and ugliness and exposing it to the globe. And so they just felt that there was no way that this individual could be a committed Christian or a clergyman. And then they would use that excuse to surveil him. And then any type of behavior they felt was not befitting of a Christian minister, they would then use as counterintelligence, both within the federal government and within other religious organizations, and show people illegally, here's what we've collected on him in terms of surveillance. This guy's not a Christian. So therefore, whatever he's talking about in terms of equality and all that stuff, don't believe it. He's just trying to tear the country apart.
Right. Right. That makes sense. I mean, it makes sense as a tactic.
Right.
Let's see, I believe it was the early 70s, and he's been lionized for all of these decades as this Christian hero. And then the actual investigation and subsequent disclosures of what happened with COINTELPRO actually come out in the public, and things start to shift a little bit in terms of public opinion.
Yes. And in 1971, there's a brilliant PBS documentary called 1971. And it is about a group of average American citizens, Christians, Catholics, and Jews, come together, and they form a group called the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI.
Which is awesome, yeah.
and they are led in part by a religion professor from Temple named John Raines. And they are convinced that the FBI is engaging in illegal behaviors because of their activism that they've done. John Raines actually goes on as a part of the civil rights movement and is involved in a protest. And he says that that's the first time he was really on the other side of power as a white man. And it really influenced him. So they decide they're going to try to find evidence to prove that the FBI has been engaging in illegal tactics and surveilling people without warrants and political intimidation and investigating people not for crimes, but for their political beliefs.
Yeah. So
on the night of a Muhammad Ali fight, they actually break in to a FBI resident agency. So the FBI has field offices in major cities, St. Louis, several in New York City, LA, but they have smaller resident agency offices in smaller areas. They broke into one in Media, Pennsylvania. They held this secret for years, and as the statute of limitations passed and a number of them were getting close to dying, they told their story to Betty Metzger. And in that story, they point out that they had one of the wives dress up as a sophomore student. She went to the resident agency to say she was doing a story for the student newspaper to interview an FBI agent about what are the career opportunities for women in the FBI. The only opportunities were administrative, right? They were not hiring men to investigate. And while she's there, she's actually casing the joint. She cases the joint, comes back, does the lay of the land for everyone, and then they break in and they steal documents. The documents that they steal have on this stamp, COINTELPRO. They take these documents, they send them to major newspapers. The Department of Justice and the FBI demand the documents back, say they've been stolen. There's only one newspaper who goes to print, and it's the Washington Post, because it's led by Katharine Graham. And Katharine Graham says, no, the American public needs to know this. LA Times, New York Times, they all mail it all back and give it back to the FBI. And that's when we learn that the FBI has been engaging in surveillance of student groups, women's groups, civil rights groups for their political beliefs. Carl Stern, who works for NBC News, sees COINTELPRO stamped on these documents. He's fascinated. What does this phrase mean? He goes to court, gets the federal court to order the FBI has to turn over all the documents that say COINTELPRO, learns that it stands for Counterintelligence Program. And then so we go from a couple documents to over 20,000 documents. And these are released to the public. And it starts the Senate Select Intelligence Committee. And that's when we finally learned that what the FBI has been doing in 1973, 74, the world begins to know. And all of it gets blamed on J. Edgar Hoover as a convenient scapegoat because he's dead now, right? But in reality, though, it's a whole entire system, right, that allowed Hoover to do these things. And many of the presidents knew that he was doing these things, including JFK and LBJ, and never stopped him.
Right. I just feel like it takes such guts to do what that group of people did. It's so hard to imagine having
it does. It does. And let me just tell you about the Citizens Committee to investigate the FBI. Some of these folks, and they talk about this in the documentary, some of these folks had children.
Yeah.
And so they were risking, if they ever got caught, a life away from their children.
Right.
But they all made the decision, if something happens to us, such and such will take care of our kids. And John Raines and his wife, Bonnie, and others, they all felt that the fact that we had children did not remove us from the responsibility of being citizens.
Right.
And so they did this and kept it secret for years, looking over their shoulders, always being paranoid and afraid till the statute of limitations passed, right?
Right.
But they lived for years. And the documentary does a wonderful job of talking to their children who are now adults. Mm-hmm. And, their daughter is like, yeah, I'm kind of pissed. Like, like mom and dad really put us in a dangerous situation. Like what would have happened had they got caught?
Right.
But they didn't. And, and Hoover pursued them for years and they never got caught. But they decided that this is something that they felt like their citizenship forced them to do. They felt obligated to reveal that their government was acting in ways that were not just immoral, but also illegal.
Right.
And they felt they needed to expose it.
Right, right. And, to bring it a little bit into the present day, I just can't help but think about, the victory of Zohran Mamdani in New York and the way that it just feels like all of these powerful forces are coming out of the woodwork very explicitly, Democrats, Republicans, to discredit him as this communist agent, as this, this secret Muslim agent who's, sneaking into American politics when, what really resonated about his message in New York was just making New York affordable.
That's right.
Thinking about the working class. How do we just make life better for the common person in the city, right? And I just think that seeing the way he's being smeared by the billionaire class and their, many cronies out in the world, I feel like we're seeing the echoes of this white Christian nationalism in this moment, obviously in many ways, but it just feels very particular with what's happening in the New York mayoral race.
I mean, it's, what you hit on is that, again, it's not engaging the argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not engaging the argument of, let's talk about affordability. Let's talk about public transportation and buses. Let's talk about this. And I'm sure he would be open to a policy debate.
Sure, I'm sure he would.
About these very issues.
In fact, I think he's asking for it a lot.
I think exactly. But unfortunately, right, when we just sort of dismiss someone with no evidence of saying this person is a communist, this person is woke, this person is this, that, and the third, it allows you to escape having to actually debate the policy questions, right? And so it's a shorthand, quick way to basically dismiss someone. So you are not patriotic, you are not one of us, you are un-American, therefore your ideals are void. And that's not what a democracy is about.
Right.
A democracy is deliberative, right? We're supposed to debate these ideals openly and honestly so that we can figure out, right, what is the best way to serve the people of this nation.
Right.
And not simply just dismiss someone based on unsubstantiated claims. And even think about the discriminatory way of saying this person is a Muslim.
Right.
Right. That just sort of paints, right, that Islam in and of itself, right, is somehow other, is somehow evil. It doesn't even, it becomes this kind of slur that people want to use. And we have to fight against that, right? We have to fight. If we're going to live in a democracy, we're going to live in a world where people can be atheist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever they want to be, right?
Right.
And engage in public debate. That's what it means to live in a multiracial, multicultural democracy.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think it brings me back to this question that we haven't gotten to yet, which is when we're looking at J. Edgar Hoover and the legacy of the FBI, we've talked about the way that they, approached race and gender. How were they approaching economic policy? How was capitalism part of their Christian mission?
A great question. During this time, because of America's fight against Russia in the Cold War, laissez-faire capitalism gets sort of into this package deal with Christianity, right? And so there are many ministers connecting with corporations who will say, if individuals have a choice to make between good and evil to determine the eternal fate of their souls, then people should also have choice in the marketplace.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And so they begin to make this sort of package deal to say that capitalism is sort of an economic expression of Christianity. This is what God wants, right? This is how we know, because it's about choice. And so we shouldn't have the federal government taking over certain industries. We shouldn't have the federal government involved in regulating the market, right? I mean, we want the invisible hand of the market to govern itself. And therefore, this is what it means to be Christian. So Hoover will then see anybody who is advocating for structural change, whether that be in terms of sexuality, gender, race, or economics. Hoover will see that person as certainly as a communist.
More after this. And now back to the show. Something that I found so interesting about your book, which is something I wasn't expecting, was this idea that J. Edgar Hoover was a true believer. He was not this, political charlatan necessarily, which was, surprising to me because I often just cast that idea upon people like J. Edgar Hoover. But I'm wondering, and maybe we can get more into this, but he was a true believer in capitalism as well, then, I imagine. Was it benefiting him in some way? Like, did he have his hands in different coffers, or was this a genuine belief that capitalism and Christianity were the only two compatible forces?
Yeah, he felt that there were only two compatible forces, right? And it gave people choices in the marketplace. And, this is the Christianity he's raised with. And I think that he's a true believer in that form of Christianity. And I think we should always go into a conversation with someone, especially around religion and politics. We should always assume the person is genuine. I think we should assume that until they prove us otherwise, right? And I think that we have to. I know, and I think, but but what helps us to recognize that, though, is Hoover and others like him that show that there's this long tradition within American life of people bringing Christianity and capitalism together as kind of natural expressions, right? That they are complementary. It's a package deal. There's a long tradition of that, right? There are people during FDR's presidency in the 30s, because of the way the FDR was expanding the federal government, right, who accused of FDR as being the Antichrist. Right? Like, this guy is expanding the federal government. He's trying to have you worship government instead of God.
Right.
This guy's the Antichrist. This is what the Antichrist would do. He's going to have one big world government, right? And people thought he was the Antichrist. And it was all in the name. He was trying to give us social security, right? He's a socialist, right? And so people thought that he was the Antichrist. So my point is that there's a long tradition here in this country of people who bring these two together. And I think if we recognize that, we won't be surprised when we see it being uttered today, that these people are somehow being disingenuous or being fake. They're articulating a long-held tradition in American life.
Right, right. It makes me think about many years ago now, we did an episode on the Westboro Baptist Church. And
yes.
I mean, when I tell you, I did everything in my power to just get into that mindset. And I did come away after reading books, after watching everything I could, being like, yep, true believers. This is not coming from a place other than a deep Calvinistic impulse that they had. And it was, it wasn't even about money or power or even this cult. It was just people who were obviously indoctrinated, but were true believers. And it did make me engage with them in a different way. I don't know exactly what that means or what that different way was, but I expected to find behind that facade of like this religious extremism. I felt like I was going to find something that was what would it be? Like that was not genuine.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought of. Yeah.
You know what? And you know what I think that does for us is I think what it does is it removes us from trying to do the hypocrisy, like, yes. I caught you. Like you're not being morally consistent or you're not being truthful. It moves us away from that. And then it moves us to, okay, if this person is sincere and genuine in their belief, let me move away from the aha moment and let me see if I can, instead of calling them out, call them into a different narrative.
Sure.
Right. And that exposes them to different experiences. Well, let me introduce you to this story or this person who doesn't quite fit the worldview that you're putting forth. Right. Mm-hmm. Or let me tell you this narrative or this story. I think it helps us to call people in to tell different kinds of stories as opposed to being focused on the aha moment. And let me call you out. Let me expose your hypocrisy. Right. Because typically, although that might feel good to us, those who disagree with them, it typically doesn't serve our purpose, which is to try to change hearts and minds, right? Or to change people. Typically, that only makes people want to dig their heels in even more.
Yeah, that I understand. Yeah.
Right. So if we're really interested in changing people's hearts and minds, I think around these issues, especially that are harmful to other human beings, then I think we have to think about calling them into something different. But I know that only works for those individuals who are open to listen. Right. Yep. You got to have genuine conversation on both sides. Yeah. And I think liberals are so busy pointing out the kind of, what we see now maybe is the hypocrisy or the insincerity of religious conservatives that we don't recognize that we also maybe aren't open to having genuine conversation, that we're only trying to expose and the aha moment and call people out. But both sides have to be open to actually listen and have a conversation. And typically, that only happens in relationship. Right. Typically doesn't happen when you're on Facebook or on social media. Typically it can happen, but those sincere conversations often have to happen through relationship. Yeah. And those relationships can be developed on social media, let's be clear, but not a random encounter. I mean, that typically doesn't happen.
No, I think that's only going to, unfortunately, exacerbate a situation. That's right. It might feel kind of good in the moment to have something tangible to punch at.
Right.
But,
right.
Big picture,
right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Tell your friends, look, I was arguing and I won this argument. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
Yep. So I am wondering if I think one of the most traumatic things happening right now in the country is what's happening to our immigrant neighbors, friends, community members. And I didn't get to this in your book, so I'm not sure how much you talk about it, but how was the FBI, how was J. Edgar Hoover involved in the debate around immigration and about how we deal with maybe this idea that immigrants have this subversive element to their personalities when we obviously know that that's not true in any general sense?
Unfortunately, Hoover really rises to power based on that narrative.
Really?
Hoover is running the alien, I think it's, forgive me, that's called the Alien Sedition Unit within the Bureau of Investigation before he's in charge. And he's the one that pioneers the Palmer raids in the 1920s. And this was a coordinated raid across the country of people that, quote unquote, were supposedly communist, but they were mostly just people who were, immigrants in this country. And he had coordinated raids and rounded up thousands of people and wrote up the warrants and the arrest warrants after the fact, right? And most of these folks, the overwhelming majority of all of them, were released because of the illegality of these raids, but because of his willingness to do that and to organize those raids, even though that it was legally a failure, it really brought him to the fore of the federal government. And then following those raids, he ends up becoming the head of the Bureau of Investigation, which later is the FBI. So unfortunately, Hoover's willingness to engage in those types of tactics and narratives really helps propel him to power. And he holds on to that ideal that these people who come to this country, who quote unquote refuse to assimilate to certain what he says will be American ideals, are enemies.
Right.
And so he's very, very, very concerned about that. And unfortunately, it feels like, we're going back to those days in the way that, people are being rounded up for no reason other than the fact of their immigration status. And I think Hoover, unfortunately, is a pioneer of that tactic.
Right. It seems like he was a pioneer of so much of what we're seeing today. I'm thinking of the suppression and the censorship of all kinds of voices that are advocating for Palestine. A lot of that's happening on college campuses. And I just feel like we're seeing the same kind of censorship and rhetoric. And I'm wondering about the level to which the FBI might be involved in these modern movements. I mean, you did talk about Michael Brown and how the FBI was involved in what was happening in Ferguson and speaking with religious leaders about it. And I'm wondering what you think, or maybe even what you know about the involvement of the FBI in suppressing some of the modern movements that we are seeing right now.
There's a lot of things that we don't know as the FBI is now under the leadership of Kash Patel.
Right.
There's a lot of things we don't know as of yet. But what we do know is that there were some signs of the role that Christianity, a certain kind of Christianity, was playing within the FBI in the post-Hoover years. Some of the worship services continued. Some of the preachers in the 80s were Pat Robertson,
right,
spoke for the FBI twice from the 700 Club. There was the NPR did a story in the early 2000s that said the Westboro Baptist Church was invited to come talk to FBI agents in training.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay.
I'm not quite sure what that was said. The FBI released a statement once the news broke that they brought them in so that FBI agents could get an up close and personal look at religious extremists. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. Hard to say, but we know that. We also know the FBI for a long time, especially during the quote unquote war on terror, began to sort of capitulate and push forward an idea that Islam and terrorism were, one and the same. Mm-hmm. I'll give you one example. When I taught this class at Washington University in St. Louis, it was called The FBI and Modern American Religion and Politics. At the end of the course, to be fair, I invited the local FBI field office in St. Louis. They had a community liaison, and I would always invite the community liaison to come speak to the class at the end of the class, so students could both ask him questions about what they had learned and then hear the FBI's kind of response. Mm-hmm. I thought that it was a great way for my students to not just hear my voice, but also to hear the voice of the actual subject matter.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the lectures that they gave that was approved by headquarters. This was during Christopher Wray's administration of the FBI. They had this chart and they laid out, here's the sort of narrative that we see in people who are geared towards terrorism. And they had a chart that was like America or our country or our religion was once great. Mm-hmm. Something happened and now we've been brought to ruin. Mm-hmm. We've got to act in a very brave, risky way to bring back this golden age. And if we do, there'll be a reward. Right. And then so next to that slide, he put forth how that is articulated in Islam. Mm-hmm. And so one of my brilliant undergraduate students said, do you have a version that also shows how Christianity can have that narrative?
Wow. Okay.
That America was once great. Christianity ruled, something happened. Now we are on the bottom. We are no longer, ruling. We're no longer in control. We have to do something drastic to bring back in control. And he said, no, we don't. And so that led me to believe that at least at that point in time, there was a blind spot within the FBI that as it related to how kind of a white Christian violence can be a running narrative in this country, and the kind of ideas that this type of violence has to be committed. And they didn't have a narrative for that in the FBI. All they had at the time was, as it related to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, I think we have these, data points that maybe can point us in the direction to see that maybe there are still some blind spots within the Bureau today. They say they've learned from their surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. They have a quote of Martin Luther King Jr. at the FBI training facility. The time is right to always do what is right.
Yeah.
And they say they've learned from that. But time will tell if they've actually learned from the fact that people who challenge certain types of social norms are not always threats to the country, right? Especially if they're doing it non-violently the way that King did.
Right.
But, we'll see if the FBI has learned from that.
Yeah, I guess we have to wait 50 years or something like that, unfortunately. One thing that was also so interesting to me, this is a bit of a shift, but I am a bit of a biblical history nerd myself.
Oh, great. Great.
And so I think that what stuck out to me was this, that the FBI actually investigated a biblical translation. And,
yes.
And I think it's a good example of how maybe the idea of what Christianity was he may have been a true believer, but he was a true believer that liked to place his political beliefs, layer them over his religion. So would you talk about the Bible translation controversy in the FBI?
Yeah, Hoover actually investigated the Bible. So there was
wild way to put it. Yep.
There was a translation of the Bible that many use today. It was at the time it was called the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. It is now going through some more translations. It is now the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. It is a version of the Bible that many people enjoy because of the way that it scholarly translation. Mm-hmm. When it came out as a Revised Standard Version of the Bible, there was a portion of the text in Isaiah that many Christians point to as a prophecy for the Messiah, where the text says that a virgin shall be with child. Mm-hmm. The Revised Standard Version of the Bible, in its scholarly translation, pointed out in the footnotes that the word virgin was also the same word and used in that text is also the same word for young girl or maiden, and put that in the footnotes. Mm-hmm. A number of conservative Christians were very upset and felt that this was a communist move by these leftist clergy to detract from the virgin birth of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so they said, if they're going to question that, then they're questioning everything of our faith. This must be a communist plot.
Right.
And Hoover, being a committed Christian as he is, began actually an investigation, a domestic intelligence investigation on the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. He had his agents read this translation of the Bible to study it. And they also did surveillance and investigation on the ministers and scholars who are part of the committee to draft this translation of the Bible. So that's how concerned he was as it relates to these things in terms of religion and politics. And there's a funny story also that I'll share that he went to when he was running the FBI in the Truman administration. Truman was very suspicious of Hoover. He felt that Hoover was going too far. In fact, Truman says in his diary, the FBI is tending towards the Gestapo. We don't want a Gestapo in the U.S. So Truman was a little bit suspicious of Hoover. So they're having a conversation reportedly in Truman's office, and Truman is complaining that a number of politicians he supported in Congress have turned their back on him and are no longer supporting him. Mm-hmm. And Hoover, in an attempt to comfort him, says, well, Mr. President, even Christ was betrayed once. Mm-hmm. And Truman responds, no, Christ was denied and betrayed 3 times, not just once. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hoover leaves the office incensed. He's upset. He prides himself on knowing his Bible. He actually has agents investigate if it's true, was Christ denied or betrayed 3 times?
Okay.
And agents in the domestic intelligence division are literally writing notes and memos saying the boss wants us to investigate Jesus Christ to see if this is true. And so they actually go through and they're like really trying to figure out who's going to be the one to tell him that, yeah, like Peter denies him, right? Thomas doubts him. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Judas betrays him. Like, who's going to be the one to tell him that Truman is right?
Wow. Yeah.
And in the end, when he dies, it's noted that Hoover had a picture of every single president that he served under in his house, except for Truman.
Wow. Kind of a petty guy, huh?
He was very petty. He was very petty, McBetty. He was very petty, especially when it came to his Bible. He was a Sunday school teacher. He counted knowing the Bible as, that it would be, that that's what he knew. That's what his faith was based on. That's what his politics were based on. And he could be very petty about it.
Wow. Wow.
From investigating a translation of the Bible to holding a grudge against the president.
Yeah. He sounds a little bitchy. I'll just say it. So yet, you believe that he was a true believer. And so I think it's really interesting that we have this biblical literalism that's really, really important in America.
Yeah.
And yet we aren't willing to investigate that literalism any further by saying, maybe we got this wrong, or maybe this isn't the original translation of the Bible. Maybe this has been altered by people in power throughout, centuries. And we don't really want to actually truly understand what the Bible says.
Yeah.
So do you think that this idea that we cannot reimagine the Bible or even read the Bible in a different way than we have been allowed to in, American tradition, or I should say maybe the white American tradition. Do you think that there is just this privileging of the status quo that keeps us afraid of reimagining or understanding the Bible in a different way? Like, it just seems like our politics have become more important than what the Bible says. The Bible it's not all great, but there's some really great stuff in there, specifically Sermon on the Mount, this idea of economic justice. And how many people out there, when we're looking at maybe the Trump administration, do you consider these people also to be true believers? And I'm sure it varies person to person, but I guess I'm interested in how much of this is true belief and how much of it is this ability to use the last several decades of the architecture of American religion by people like Hoover and, kind of like privilege the politics over that and use it for power. And I think that's definitely true. I'm being long-winded here, but I guess I'm trying to figure out the Christian religion, like what role the Christian religion is actually playing right now, and what about it is this legacy of the connection of politics to Christianity and how that can serve, specifically powerful, wealthy Americans, who are white, generally speaking. Yeah.
You know what I think? I think that biblical literacy in our country is extremely low.
Yeah.
And I think, and what that allows is for people to come to the text and they already assume that they know. Mm-hmm. And they also come to the text and they've already baptized it in the American flag.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an assumption that American institutions, whether they be capitalism, whether it's one's shopping habits, whether it's one's viewing habits, are already connected to biblical faith. Mm-hmm. And so I think they then come to the text, it's baptized in the American flag, and then they're not looking to draw meaning out from the text itself, but are actually then reading meaning into the text. And so that's what biblical scholars would call exegesis, is when you're trying to pull meaning out, versus like eisegesis when you're reading meaning into the text.
Ooh, okay. That's good. Yeah.
And I think what most Americans unfortunately do is that they're reading the American ideals, American exceptionalism into the Bible. And so when they see something, they're like, aha, see, there it is. The Bible supports this idea.
Right.
But in reality, they've come to the Bible not to read it to gain meaning, but they've come to it as a proof text.
Right. Right.
They're looking to the Bible to only back up what they already believe. And what they already believe is in this idea of American exceptionalism, that America is somehow special, and that God has a special place for America. And then when you read it that way, right, it's easy to go past the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
It's easy to go past the fact that Jesus mentions poverty, over and over and over and over again in the text as one of the things he's concerned about. Mm-hmm. It's easy to miss out on the fact that Jesus himself, right, was looking for a home country, right, because his family was fleeing, right, that they were, worried about him being murdered. So I think that it's easy to miss all that stuff when you come with preconceived ideas already.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And so I think those people then are true believers in that kind of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it takes for them to be exposed into different kinds of stories, different narratives, to really be able to think differently. And I think what we have to realize is that in a kind of nationalistic Christianity, if we look through history and even looking up to today, most people aren't looking to Jesus's Sermon on the Mount. They're actually looking at what Christians would call the Old Testament, right?
Right.
They're finding their justification in the Old Testament and saying like, look, it's in the Bible, right? This idea that we should go and dominate other countries, or that people who don't believe in our faith should be wiped off the planet. I think they're looking to those texts and not looking for what Christians say they do, which is follow Jesus.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's odd because, maybe we take the ultra wealthy as an example of, this group of people that Christians seem to be venerating, which is so bizarre, right? It's so bizarre to see billionaires held up as like these like moral beacons. Like that's not exactly right, but they're not condemned in any way. They're part of the American Christian tradition. It shows like we can be saved by, these billionaires or whatever people think. I'm not sure, and you just have to go into the Bible and you really have to be like, okay, it says poverty again and again. It says it's hard for the rich to get into heaven, but not impossible. And that's what I see people saying. Right. You can say, well, it's very anti-biblical to hoard wealth and not pay your fair share of taxes, etc. But then it's just like you bypass all of that to find like this one little thing that allows you to continue on with your worldview about what Christianity means. And it's quite maddening. And I'm sure you find it quite difficult being a biblical scholar yourself. I'm sure it can be quite annoying.
One of the things that I find really helpful was that Martin Luther King Jr. used to preach this a sermon a lot from his pulpit. We forget that King, in addition to leading marches, actually was a pastor, right? He talked to people about everyday things. And he likes to point to the story in the Bible about the rich man and Lazarus. Mm-hmm. In the story, those who know it or don't know it, long story short, Lazarus is a beggar who stands outside the rich man's gate begging for food, and the rich man never gives it to him. And then at the end of the story, Lazarus ends up in heaven and the rich man ends up in hell. Mm-hmm. And King says that story is to teach us not that there's something inherently evil with wealth and there's something inherently virtuous with poverty. But he says the problem is that, the text doesn't tell us the rich man, especially in the ancient Near East, gained his wealth through ill-gotten gain or did something evil, right? The problem, King says, and that is not the wealth so much, is that the man's wealth blinded him towards everyday suffering.
Right.
The man's wealth blinded him, and so that his means possessed him as opposed to he possessed his means. And that it blinded him from suffering. It blinded him from people who weren't like him. And somehow it made him feel that he was somehow better. Right. Mm-hmm. Instead of the idea that maybe there was the accidents of circumstances that put Lazarus in the position of being a beggar and put him in the position of being really wealthy. And so King says that, for those who are wealthy, that they should recognize their wealth is their opportunity. Their wealth is their opportunity to help alleviate suffering, to help others who may not have been as fortunate as they are. And I think that's that I like to think about as I think about, what's happening in our country with wealth inequality, right? Is that we've got to have folks, especially Christians, right? People who have access to resources, and people of goodwill, not just Christians, but think about their wealth as an opportunity. Right. So the civil rights movement, we had freedom fighters, people who marched, people who put their lives on the line. But the civil rights movement also had freedom funders, people who gave money and resources so that people could have food while they were marching, so that people could get bailed out while they were being, put in jail. And a lot of these folks came forward, wasn't just wealthy individuals, but wealthy organizations and nonprofits came forward to fund actions for freedom. And I think that that's what we need to revitalize today amongst those who have resources, is that their wealth is their opportunity.
Yeah, that was very well put. Thank you. Do you think that as we close this out, there's anything else that you want to tell us about J. Edgar Hoover as a man, or about him, like where he ended up, what the end of his life was like, just anything that you think we should know that we haven't talked about yet about our little Edgar?
I would say two things. I would say the first and foremost is that he had a version of Christianity that he really believed in, that the ends justified the means.
Okay.
He was so sure of his ideals and that he was right and that he was fighting for God and with God, that it allowed him to completely inoculate himself from any type of a moral compass of how he got there.
Yeah.
And I think that one lesson we can learn from his life is that, and this is what Martin Luther King Jr. tried to teach us, is that means and ends have to be commensurate. That if you truly think you're searching for moral ends, you want a moral society, your means have to be moral in order to get there, right? You can't use lying and cheating and stealing to then try to create a moral society. Right. And I think that Hoover was so assured of his ends that he would use immoral means, illegal wiretapping, breaking into offices and buildings, surveilling people, lying, cheating, in order to achieve what he thought were moral ends. And I think that it's a lesson that eventually that crashes down.
Right. Right.
And connected to that, I'd say that we have to be mindful of this history because, I say at the end of the book that Hoover is kind of like a ghost in the sense that, ghosts are simultaneously nowhere yet everywhere at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't know this history, we're very much so in danger of repeating it. And Hoover's ghost is very much so still with us. The FBI headquarters is still called the J. Edgar Hoover Building. It's still on Pennsylvania Avenue, America's Main Street. And we now have someone who's running the FBI that seems at least to be taken with Hoover's ideals around the role of Christianity, conservative Christianity in public life. And I think that, we have to educate ourselves to see where that can lead us. And I think the past is full of lessons for us to learn so that we don't repeat some of our mistakes in the future.
Well, I believe that. I feel like I live in the past 90% of my life doing this show. So, well, Lerone, this was just so great. I so appreciate you and your work. And I hope that everyone will check out your new book. And,
Thank you.
Just please come back anytime you feel like you have something to say, because we love you here. And we just have a lot of gratitude for what you do.
Thank you. I'm finishing up a book now on Martin Luther King Jr.'s teenage years.
Oh, okay. That sounds great.
So when the book will be out in April, so we'll talk again then.
Absolutely.
It's about, my sons have taught me that every superhero has a backstory. And so this is kind of the backstory about someone who did not want to be a minister, someone who says that they were atheists at one point in time. And most of what we know about him sort of writes these books are written about him as if it's inevitable that he's going to be a minister. And this book is pointing out the moments in his own life where he had heavy doubts and the things that he went through that brought him to the point where he decided to be a minister. So I'll make sure you get a copy, and I hope that, we'll get a chance to talk again about that.
I hope so too. We'll make sure we make it happen.
All right.
Well, thanks again, Lerone. I so appreciate it.
Thank you.
This was American Hysteria. If you enjoyed this interview, please make sure you get a copy of Lerone's book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, and go back and listen to our episode from 2020 called Black Evangelicalism and the Christian Right. If you want to support our show, and we can definitely use your support, and get ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get access to the other podcast I do with our producer Miranda called Hysteria Home Companion, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we cover and stories that we know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you can leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up, or even a tale that you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. You can also leave us a 5-star review on the app of your choosing. It really helps us out, and you can follow us on Instagram at American Hysteria Podcast. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.